then I'll also just quickly introduce the ICLEI folks that are here with me. So my name is Kernis McGoldrick. I am ICLEI Canada's Communications Manager, and I'll be leading today's session. But I'm joined today by Eva Jackson, our Managing Director and the Director of ORCA, who is normally the one who leads webinars, but today she'll be speaking, giving us a presentation, and then participating along with everyone else. I also have Haley Anderson, who is one of our project coordinators, who will be presenting on some of the content, and then Adrienne Coulter, who I think everyone would have seen an email coming from her yesterday with that pre-event, those few pre-event pieces that we wanted to share. And we won't do introductions because there are quite a few of us on here. So yeah, without further ado, I will share my screen and we can dive straight on in. Let's just make sure I share the right screen. And here you go. Is everyone seeing the title slide? I had a few issues earlier. Okay, I'm seeing a few nods. Perfect. Okay, so welcome to the Behavioral Strategies to Inspire Climate Action training session here today. As we get started, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that reconciliation, truth and reconciliation, is fundamental to building equitable, net zero, and climate resilient communities. This is something that we keep in mind through the process of our work at ICLEI Canada and ORCA. And I'd invite you to do the same as we go through the content that we're sharing today, to keep in mind that truth and reconciliation requires ongoing learning, unlearning, reflection, and action, and communications is an opportunity to do that. I also want to let you know that I'm hosting this webinar from my home remote office in Thunder Bay, Ontario, which is located on the Fort William First Nation Treaty Territory, signatory of the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850. And today, we are doing quite a bit of things today. So we've got 2 hours. We'll be here from 1 until 3 o'clock. We've divided this session into 2 parts. Part 1 will set the context, or set the tone and set some context about communications in general. We'll unpack communications then and now concepts that are included in the Climate Communications Playbook that you would have all received in your inboxes yesterday, and that's now available online. And then in part 2, we will unpack behavioral strategies and talk about how those can be integrated into climate communications. We have some activities that we'll be doing throughout the session, including a few polls. So now's a really good time to make sure that you have your activity sheet that you would have received in your inbox yesterday. Make sure that it's pulled up or that you have it in front of you. And I think Adrienne is going to be dropping links throughout the whole webinar. So I think the link to the activity sheet is in the chat. If you didn't get a hold of it before now, you can do so right now. And then keep an eye on the chat throughout the session. We will be sharing links to make it as easy as possible to get the materials you need, and make sure that you can follow along as we go. And so I believe that's what I want to say, but a few pieces of housekeeping. So you heard us start recording for this webinar. So this webinar is being recorded. And then we will share the recording with all the participants at the end of the session, as soon as it's available in the next few days. We will also be making the recording accessible to everyone once the whole 3-week training series is done at the end of February. And today's webinar is in English, as you know. And in terms of asking questions and participating, please ask questions in the chat. Like I mentioned, Adrienne is going to be in the chat. She will do her best to answer questions in the chat in real time. If there's anything that would be great for some of the presenters to talk about or to answer, she will relay that information over to us. And you can also raise your hand. So again, this is a meeting, it's not a webinar. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand. And then we'll either try to answer your questions in real time or kind of answer all the questions at the end of each sort of presentation segment of the session. And I hope my volume is better, but I'll try to speak loudly so that everyone can hear. And I think that is it for housekeeping. So I will start with a very quick introduction to the toolkit and giving some context to this training series. So this training series is part of a brand new Climate Communication Toolkit that was launched yesterday. The toolkit is really about recognizing that climate communications requires for people to do a lot more than know information and facts on climate change. It's about making people feel motivated, inspired, and truly ready to take action. So it's going beyond, raising awareness about climate change. The Climate Communications Toolkit is designed to help everyone, anyone and everyone do that by using communications in a really action-oriented way. And to do this, we've integrated behavioral strategies or behavioral insights into the way we approach climate communications. And that's really what we'll be doing today. I wanted to mention that the toolkit itself is designed with resilience in mind, but that doesn't mean it's only applicable to resilience. You can also definitely use it for climate mitigation, biodiversity, and other sustainability initiatives. The aim of the toolkit is really to get you used to using climate communications in an action-oriented way and become so skillful at it that you can integrate it into every aspect of your work, whether it's day-to-day conversations at work, presenting to council, working with organizations, everything at all. So as part of the toolkit, really quickly, we've got 3 elements. The first one is this communications playbook. The playbook includes the actionable approaches and strategies for really creating that action-oriented communications activities. The playbook itself is divided into 3 parts. Part 1 talks about climate communications then and now, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later on in today's session. Part 2 of the playbook is really about the approaches for creating climate communications campaigns or kind of putting together climate communications activities. And then part 3 is all about behavioral strategies that can be integrated into communications. And we'll talk more about that later in today's session. So pages 8 to 13 and 35 to 45 are really the sections of the playbook that we're unpacking today, but we'll touch on a bit of content from throughout the playbook as well. And the next part of the toolkit are a series of communication case stories. So we have 30 case stories that provide real world examples of climate communications that use behavioral insights to really engage different audiences. We'll touch on 6 of them today, but we have so many examples. These examples, these case stories are designed to provide inspiration and a starting point so that you can see how behavioral strategies can be integrated into real climate campaigns for a number of different initiatives. They're not comprehensive. We're not doing a comprehensive case story on the actual communication activities. This is just our interpretation of, oh, wow, look at this. They use these behavioral insights. How interesting. And what came out of that. So keep in mind in the behavioral strategies or the behavioral case studies here, that a lot of organizations and municipalities actually do integrate behavioral insights into their comms activities, whether they do so intentionally or not. And that's because behavioral strategies really work well. And so there's a lot of things like visual storytelling or storytelling, positive framing. It's things that a lot of us already do. We might just not do it so intentionally. And today we'll just dive into what that all means so that we can be a little bit more deliberate with how we use them in our communications. And then the last piece of the toolkit is what we're doing today. So we are offering a climate communications training series to help put the insights that we share in the playbook into action. So it's one thing to talk about all these concepts. It's another thing to show examples of how they're put into practice through the case stories, but it's another thing yet to put them into practice, to try them out, to work it out. And so that's what the training is for. This is one of 3 trainings that we're doing to go along with the launch of the toolkit. We'll have more trainings in the future. And again, like I mentioned earlier, the recording for this session, as well as the following 2 sessions, will be available once the training series is done, so that can be a resource as well. And I think I've just mentioned it, but we are going to be offering webinars and trainings in the future, and we do climate communications workshop on an ongoing basis. So we're always doing some form of training in some way or another. For this week 1 of our training series, our goal is to really equip you with the behavioral strategies that can be integrated into your climate communications. And then if you are registered for weeks 2 and 3, if you were able to register before they filled out, the content that we're covering today will really give you a great foundation to then develop messaging in week 2 and really think about the channels, the platforms, and the mediums that you can use to optimize your communications in week 3. But today is all about behavioral strategies, communications then and now, and how we can really make our communications as action-oriented as possible. So, first activity after all that talking. So just to start and to ground the rest of what we'll be talking about today in tangible climate action, I would invite everyone to identify a climate action that you would like to keep in mind as we go through today's session. So I know that this was included in the email you received yesterday. And then here we have a bit of a framework that you can find on page 1 of your activity sheet to get as detailed as possible, which is the name of the game in communications. You want to get quite specific. So here we're asking you to think of your climate action tree. So you can write down in your activity sheet, what is your climate action trunk, or the broad strategic goal that you would like to work with. So for example, it could be reduce basement flooding. And then from that broad strategic goal, what is the climate action branch? And a branch here, we're talking about an action that has a very specific outcome. For example, to reduce basement flooding could be to increase the uptake in backflow valve subsidy program. So something more specific than the trunk. And then even more specific, and especially because in communications, we're always communicating to people or to an audience, put your outcome in the context of an audience. So we're calling this the leaf. So what outcome would you like to achieve by engaging a certain audience through your climate communications? So for this example, it would be to increase the uptake in backflow valve subsidy program in the hillside neighborhood. So getting quite specific so that we can really think of the audience and how we want them to engage with the climate action that we'll be working with. So once you have the time to do that, I would love to hear in the chat what everyone's climate action is. So let's just take a bit of time now to introduce yourself. So if you could write your name, your organization, and then a short version of your climate action leaf and put it in the chat. Let's see what comes up. My chat disappeared, so I have to go find it a little bit. I wonder if someone else from the team has the chat handy and might want to call some out.
I do. I think people are just busy trying to figure out their branches, trunks, and leaves.
Oh, I found the chat. It was hiding behind everyone's cameras.
Curtis, just a request to go to the prior slide with the tree image on it, if you don't mind.
Yes. All right, we have a few a few climate action leaves coming in the chat here. So Chelsea from Oxford County leaf is providing cooling options for social housing residents. And that is a great one. Someone has given it a little thumbs up. So Tara is building up natural spaces that connect to improve migration of species. Devanshi from the Clean Air Partnership has a leaf of increasing homeowner uptake of available retrofit funding programs to install heat pumps in Dufferin County. Very specific. Danielle from Richmond Hill. I see a branch, maybe still thinking about the leaf, branches to increase uptake in home retrofit actions like heat pumps, solar, etc. Yeah. And then Sue has to help protect people who are at greater risk from heat waves and heat events, helping them protect themselves. So there's some really great ones. This is so interesting. Please keep sharing your actions as we go through, but I'm going to keep moving the slides through here in the interest of time, but this is really interesting. It's interesting to see what everyone's working on and also the level of detail, the different ways we get to think about this. And this is a good example to show that communications, really, there's no right answer. There's so many different variables. But identifying your climate action is always a really important place to start. So with this, I will hand it over to Eva to talk about climate communications then and now.
Thanks, Curtis. Thanks, everybody. It's wonderful to be here and so nice to see some familiar names and names that are new, and we're glad that you're able to make it. As Curtis mentioned, my name is Eva Jackson. I'm Managing Director with ICLEI Canada. I'm calling in today from my home in Toronto, which is on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. So I'm grateful for their stewardship over this land that I get to live, work, and play on. When Curtis asked me to do this, I thought, oh, I don't like being asked to talk about then because it makes me feel old. But I suppose myself and ICLEI have been at this for quite some time, so I'll take it as a compliment rather than a testament to my age. One of the things that I think is important to note is we as ICLEI have been at this for quite some time. In around 2011, we realized that there wasn't enough training and materials available to support municipalities in communicating about climate change. And so in 2012, and I know that it was 2012 because it was the last thing I did before I went on my mat leave, we produced Having the Climate Conversation, which at the time was one of the few resources dedicated to having conversations about climate change. Since then, we've done a lot of trainings, we've done a lot of presentations, and we've participated in a lot of workshops and learned a lot, and really have seen these trends come about, which from how we used to think about climate communications to what we are seeing now. And so that's a bit of the highlights reel that I would love to give in the next kind of 15, 20 minutes or so. So with that, we'll start to get right into things. I think somebody's clicking for me if they wouldn't mind advancing me. Thank you so much. This is my friend, and his name is General Public. And I think that is one, and I would say maybe he's not my friend, maybe he's my nemesis actually, because that is one of the biggest then statements. Is this idea that we as communicators communicate to this broad, wide general public. We include in that everyone. I think if I was a municipal person historically, we'd include in that anyone who doesn't work for the corporation or isn't an elected official. And the reality is, and I think a lot of you pointed that out in your leafs that came up in the chat, that people don't belong to this amorphous general public. You know, there are those of us who rent, those of us who own houses, those of us who have small businesses, those of us who commute a long distance. There's all different ways, parents, dog owners, there's all different ways that we create segments to which targeted and specific messaging resonates more than a one-liner that we try to see as a, be all and end all in communications. So I put general public here as a reminder of what we don't want to hear as we move through training today and in week 2 and week 3. I think some other thens, if I can call them that, are communicating through fairly typical outreach and engagement mechanisms. And so those are things like public meetings, online surveys, coffee chats. One of the challenges with those mechanisms is they ask a lot of the people we are trying to, on the people whose behavior we are trying to change. They ask them to come to us, to come to our public meeting in their either free time or their work time. We are asking people to take time to participate in an online survey on their time and to tell us information that we will use. The same with a coffee chat. I would say this is probably a bit of a step up. We are now saying it's not a public meeting. We're coming to a cafe or a coffee shop, and at least it's getting a little bit more inviting. But again, there's an ask of our audience there that isn't necessarily, doesn't feel reciprocal to the audience. The other then I talk about is a focus on facts. And we all have been to many presentations like this, whether it's data around, emissions and the number of emissions, or, international panel on climate change, intergovernmental panel on climate change, temperature graphs. Focusing on those facts has been the way we have typically tried to communicate about climate change, saying this is a compelling narrative. This should be enough. That translates into action, numbers, figures, data. And I think we can all agree that that isn't always effective. And in fact, it's effective on a very small segment of people. The other thing, and you can even tell by the way I'm talking about it, is that typically the then has centered around convincing. We're trying to convince someone and win an argument as to why someone should take action on climate change. It is very top down. It is information loaded to try and convince a behavior or win an argument, or is targeted at a group that has historically been climate denying. And I think you can see where, hopefully you can see that it represents sort of a previous way of doing things, and a way of doing things that those organizations that are really good at communicating don't do. So if you think about, the big Nikes and Coca-Colas and Air Canadas, they're not putting charts and figures in front of us, though I'm sure at their disposal they have many. They're not focusing on winning an argument. And they're certainly not asking a lot of us in terms of, finding their products and learning about them, and everything's at an ease. So with that, maybe what we can move on to is kind of why those thens haven't typically worked. And this comes from some work by a very sort of prolific behavioral psychologist who works in the climate space, Per Espen Stoknes, who's a Norwegian scholar, sort of centering that some of the reasons these things don't work is we are fundamentally behavioral beings. Logic and reason are a piece of what makes us make decisions. Um, but our decisions are information, and that logic and reason is filtered through a pretty complex set of barriers that any message, but particularly a climate message, must overcome. And I want to spend just a couple of minutes on some of those barriers. So if we look at this circle image here, one has themselves or their, whomever they're talking to at the center, and a climate message is trying to penetrate this information. And so kind of what specific barriers when we're talking about climate change do we face from this behavioral perspective? And I think the first one that maybe is in many ways the most obvious is distance. Climate really, the issue of climate change remains for many distant in a number of ways. Oftentimes, it's distant because it's perceived as something happening far away. Now, increasingly, that one is changing as these events and hazards are happening more closer to home. But if you think about that, then we often saw the image of the polar bear on the ice floe. And as tragic as it is, and I do not mean to undermine impacts in the north, which are horrific and happening at a pace that at a pace and scale that is far worse than those municipalities, those communities not in the north. But that image made climate change seem as something distant to those living in urban centers particularly, or more removed from that area. The other thing is people don't see climate change, they experience weather. And so all of us, I'm sure, have heard so much for climate change if we have a day with unseasonably warm weather in a winter month. And so that distance of climate change and weather sometimes can be problematic. It could be distant in the sense of time. The heaviest impacts we talk about are far off in temporal distance, in mid to late century. And that's hard for people to wrap their head around when they're struggling with day-to-day challenges of, housing and inflation and pricing and those challenges that are felt immediately. And despite seeing impacts now, there is still a bit of a persistent narrative that climate change feels distant from everyday concerns outside of an immediate hazard. The next sort of barrier, I think, is around doom. When climate change is framed solely as encroaching disaster that can only be addressed by loss, cost, and sacrifice, it creates a sense of doom, and people tend to want to avoid topics that give them that sense. We as humans are typically pretty averse to loss. And so a conversation that focuses around loss and giving things up tends to fall on deaf ears and tends to be ignored and is a real barrier to come through. The next one, I think, is one that we don't often think about, but is really important and probably one of the most challenging ones to get around, which is dissonance. If what we know, for example, our fossil energy use contributes to climate change, conflicts with what we do or what we want to do, drive, fly, purchase things, then that dissonance sets in. And the same happens if my attitude conflicts with those of people that are important to me. So if I am concerned about this, but the people in my circle aren't, that sense of, okay, well, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to do anything about it. I'll just sort of ignore this piece or deny this piece, which is the next barrier, I think, behavioral barrier that we're working against is, we tend to negate, ignore, or otherwise just avoid acknowledging kind of that unsettling fact and feeling we have about climate change. We can find refuge by denying it from the fear and the guilt that we feel about it. And denial also helps us get back at those who we feel are criticizing ourselves or our lifestyle choices and think that they know better about what we want to do. Um, Really, denial is an interesting one because it's a self-defense mechanism rather than an issue of, a lack of information or ignorance or a lack of, um, intelligence in some way. It's really about self-preservation. And I think that gets to the middle one, which we have ID here, but it starts with an I. Just forgive us. Identity. We filter information through our professional and our cultural identity. We look for information that confirms our existing values and notions and ideas, and we tend to filter away information that challenges them. And this speaks to a lot of what we're seeing around now and the spread of misinformation and general polarization. That prize on identity. When something speaks to us, we tend to perk up and share it and act on it more broadly. So I think it's really important to note these behavioral barriers, particularly as we go into the second part of today and look at the behavioral strategies that we've identified and we've brought together in the in the playbook to help overcome these barriers. Okay, Curtis, I'll get you to move us along. Thank you so much. So how do we kind of break through some of these barriers? I think we need to understand the power of feeling and perception rather than just logic and reason. And our allies who are elected officials do this very well. Politics centers around feeling and perception rather than just pure facts and reason and logic. And I think this is an important thing that we need to remember as we design communication strategies and communication journeys to keep this in mind. The other one really speaks to kind of meeting people where they are. And that, of course, is physically where they are. Don't always ask people to come to you, but also meeting people where they are on that spectrum of care and worry around climate change, or smaller bite-sized pieces of that story. So really making sure that we are ready to be supportive and simple and speak to those cultural and professional values and identities that are integral to who we are as individuals and members of society. And I think this last one can't be overlooked. Know that we can't do everything ourselves. We need to be ready to step back and work with partners and trusted messengers who are better allies and have similar identities and have similar cultural beliefs and cultural practices to the people we are trying to engage and the people we are asking something of. And I know that a lot of time will be spent on this over the next three weeks in the different modules, so I won't get too much into that. But I think these are really integral for not only breaking through the barriers, but you'll see the shift that's been made to the now. So with that, maybe I'll sort of wrap up with some of the trends that we see in climate communications. And the first one is a fairly obvious one, and I think has just been a shift, is kind of this trend towards more dialogue and listening, to approach climate communications and conversations around climate change with a real openness and curiosity to learn. I had a great conversation with the former mayor of Victoria, who used to host, I think once a month, like an open tea hour. And all sorts of people would come in wanting to complain about, the everyday things that happen in a city or ask big questions about vision and climate change. And she said it was a real exercise in approaching those conversations with an openness to understand somebody's perspective, to say, oh, It's really interesting that you feel that way. Can you expand on that? And I think we don't do that enough. I think when somebody comes to us with an opinion that is different than ours, we tend to immediately turn to, oh, I must convince you of my opinion and why you should change your opinion. And we see this a lot with, misinformation, for example. So trying to shift our behavior to that more dialogue and listening frame and real curiosity, I think will be an important one to apply these behavioral strategies in. Employing frames that are positive, and this is really integral to counteracting that doom phenomenon. So employing frames that support the message with positive emotions. We've tended to frame climate change as disaster, destruction, uncertainty, sacrifice. But those frames don't motivate people. They just force them into this, anxious and almost debilitating dread space. Shifting to talking about climate in terms of insurance and improving quality of life and improving the individual health and community health, being prepared, providing opportunity, whether that's for current or future generations. I think these are really interesting ways that we can reframe climate from a doom and destruction narrative to one of, if we come together, we can do these things and at the same time achieve these many myriad of co-benefits. Using story-based signals that create meaning for people. And I think this is one where there are so many examples of visual storytelling, cultural storytelling, and storytelling through lived experience and shared experience that again provide a more positive frame or a more human frame to an issue that can seem distant. And then this last one, really trying to focus our efforts on engaging with people who are in that movable space, who maybe have a concern but don't know what to do. Or if the concern was framed with something that aligned to what they're thinking about and what they're concerned about already, then they would move towards action, as opposed to that fairly small segment of the population that really is climate denying and wanting to get into argument about changing. So these are some of the trends that we're seeing. The case stories that Curtis mentioned really try to highlight how these trends have played out by all sorts of organizations, from public governments to community organizations to private sector sometimes. And I think there's some really good ones in there that articulate that. Activity 2, here we are. So you have your activity sheets in front of you, and I don't know if someone will be putting them into the chat, but activity 2 really asks you to do a bit of a self-assessment, to dig deep and be honest with yourself, and check off all the boxes that apply. The work that you're doing or that you've been involved in, check off the then practices that you think that it used or that took place. And then did the work involve any of those now practices? And check some of those off. So we ask you to think about an effort you are involved in. So not generally, does my organization, is it a then or a now? Because you could probably check off all the boxes if you were looking big. But think about a specific effort. And it could be one that you were involved in as the communicator, or it could be one that someone was asking you to communicate with them. The choice is yours. Both will work. And just think about the approaches that were used and which column they fall into. And likely, I hope, they were in both. But it's okay if they were only in the then. You're in the right spot to move on that journey with us. As you're doing so, feel free to reflect on if there are any then practice that you would particularly like to change or you think would be easier to change than others. They're not all equal. So some of them might be easier for you to imagine kind of making progress on. And then on the inverse of that, is there a now practice that you're like, yes, I really, really want to do this? For example, for me, I tend to be a lot of a talker. I'm really trying to employ the listening one. It's really hard for those of us who like to talk, but a really important one. So that's the box I would check off. And then I think, Curtis, you've got a poll. So just let me know when you want to do that. Okay, so this is one that is in Menti. So we've all been involved in those Mentimeter things. You can either use your phone and scan the QR code, or there's a chat that Adrian was able to put into the chat. I'm sorry, a link in the chat, not a chat in the chat. And you can click on that as well, which will just let you answer questions around, your reflections on the thens and the nows. And I would just urge you, it's okay to be all in the thens. It takes a long time to change these things. So please don't feel sort of embarrassed that you're listing off all these thens. It really is kind of an ongoing effort and a learning process. And I would argue even, we're lucky enough to have Curtis and Adrian on our communications team who employ these things, but our tendency sometimes as the people producing the content, is to do those, facts and figures and say everything we can. And Curtis always reminds us of, okay, let's make it simple. Let's frame this positively. So it's a learning journey for all of us. So let's see what's on here. Some of the thens. Talking to everyone about everything. That's a really common one. You think, oh, I have one chance. I have to tell them everything, as opposed to really thinking about that outcome, as Curtis urged us to think about. What's the outcome I want, and what's the one thing I have to tell them? I'm seeing a lot of centered around convincing. That's a really hard one. And I like the person who wrote, so hard not to slide back into this one, right? We think that this is our opportunity. If I just told them this thing, then maybe they would change their mind. General public, my favorite. Information and facts. Learn about targeted specific audiences. Week 2, come back for week 2. That is an hour and a half on figuring out segmenting audiences and how to do that. So I hope all those people who wrote that are either signed up or can reach out to us to get on the wait list. Asking a lot of my audience. Curtis has a lot of ideas around how to minimize that. So stay tuned. World scientists warning papers. Yes, those ones. They're important. I mean, we need to heed those warnings, but we need to reframe them when we present them to people we want to act. This is great. Is there a now question, Curtis? Yeah. Thank you. 42 responses. That's fantastic. So many of you took the time to do that. So the next question is, what is a communications now practice that you would like to do more of? And hopefully you'll look at the behavioral strategies and be able to see, this one would really help me with the now that I want. Meaningful stories. So the importance of storytelling, listening, emotion, tailoring messaging, positive scenarios. Yeah, these are, so fantastic. I'm glad that these are resonating with people. And I think, I always think about the organizations that spend hundreds of millions and billions of dollars on communications. This is what they're doing, right? The ad that Nike makes for women in their mid-40s is not the one they make for my teenage daughter. It's an entirely different campaign. It's an entirely different strategy. And oddly both work because we both fall victim to them. So I think we really need to think about, who are those non-climate people? What are they doing that we can take little nuggets of that and apply that to our climate work? And ultimately, really, that's what the playbook and the whole toolkit is meant to do, is to help give you a few of those tools to employ that. Curtis, do you think we could share some of these when we share the recording from today with participants so that they have these?
Yeah, these are wonderful. I think these and all the actions that were shared in the chat, the answers from the polls, we'll put them all together and include them in an attachment that'll go out to everyone who's here on the call today.
Yeah. So thank you. I've really enjoyed my time. I hope I was able to provide some old person thens, and my younger colleagues can provide all the young person nows. Curtis, I'll hand it back to you, but I'm here for the rest of the session if questions come up, and I'm happy to take them.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Eva. And while we have Eva here, and just after everything we just heard about communications then and now, does anyone have any questions? Feel free to put them in the chat or even raise your hand if there's something specific you'd like to ask Eva or anyone else from the team about. Oh, yeah, okay. I see Phoebe's putting up a real hand. What a concept. If you can, yeah, go ahead.
I don't have everyone in view, so if somebody put up an electronic hand, they should go first. But I would like to know if anyone here feels confident about a big global project that I am trying to convene at the moment, shifting governments of the world about high risk, high velocity, high impact events, knowing that A, governments are not always the big part of a solution. B, governments nonetheless are still in charge and still have responsibilities. And C, they're people just like ourselves who may be subject to dissonance. Trying to get them to get prepared for the weakening of the amok current, for example,
Mhm.
and other high risk events. So I don't know whether you guys, Kurnis and Eva, would, like to have a stab at how to apply these principles. But I guess I want to encourage anyone who feels like they're really bold, really brave, really ambitious, and wants to help me with tackling that. uh,
Mm.
that would be great.
Yeah, it'd be fun to Phoebe, thanks for that. And I love bold big ideas. I think that we need balance of bold big and small local. It'd be really neat to ask that question again once after phase two when you've seen the behavioral strategies, because I think I've presented some trends, but Kurnis and Haley are going to go through specific strategies. So, thinking about your idea, um, which of the strategies they present could be applied. Um, and of course, I'd encourage the whole room, you can in the chat direct message Phoebe as well. If you are like, tell me more about your big, bold idea, I'd love to know more. Please feel free to do so as well, given that, Phoebe, you've given us the invitation to do so. But I think that is one of the ideas in part two of today's training is really to think about, now that I know these barriers, and we have these trends in mind, which of these behavioral strategies could I employ at different scales at different times to advance the work that I'm trying to advance? Which, the bigger in scale and concept the idea, the harder it is, obviously, because you're trying to change something. And so maybe even breaking that big idea into more bite-sized chunks is a strategy in and of itself. So you probably weren't looking for that answer from me, but that's kind of my reflection after your intervention.
Yeah, I think what I'll say is at the end of the day, no matter how big the idea is, we're communicating with individuals. And so instead of trying to communicate with the whole world or a whole country or a whole province, city, community, we need to think who is the person I'm talking to. And we'll dive into, I mean, the playbook includes a whole section on defining your audience, and it's something that we'll cover in more detail in next week's training, week two. But the idea of, picking who you do want to talk to and then finding a way to then craft messages, integrate those behavioral strategies that we'll be talking about in a bit to really make it resonate, make them feel motivated, engaged, fired up, and ready to take action. And then that action for a big, big initiative might be something as, I mean, quote, boring, but important as setting up a meeting or a working group. In some other instances, it might be something completely different. So I think it's really about thinking of the audience, the message, and then in that framework, really thinking, okay, what are the behavioral insights here that I can apply to make this as resonant as possible, to make it as enticing to get involved as possible, so that these people will take time out of their busy days to take this action and get involved in a specific initiative.
Curtis, there's another question that I hope I have time for 2 minutes to answer a question. Okay. Sue asked in the chat, will you be talking at some point in this series about addressing the time required to engage with, listen to audiences? I think often we default to general public because time-wise it is more efficient. That is such an important point. And I think this is where one has to do a bit of an internal return on investment calculus of, is the time spent on engaging a segmented audience worth the outcome that I'm trying to get? And in order to do that, you have to really understand, what am I trying to get people to do? If you're just sort of informing, hey, this thing is happening, maybe just one panacea communication is plenty, because you're not asking someone to, install a heat pump or renovate their basement for flood protection. I think if you're asking a lot of someone, a big behavior change, I don't think there's a way to avoid spending more time in targeted engagement. Otherwise, you won't get the result you want. So you kind of have to do that little bit of a calculus every time you're designing your communications journey. And I'm getting into week 3 talk, but I think that's the part one has to think about, is what is the outcome I'm after, from whom, and what is the investment I need to make in order to get that outcome. And I don't think there's a simple, always do this, always do that. It's that self-reflection of, do I need to invest the time to get the outcome I want from the audience I'm trying to get an outcome out of? So I think, I'm not sure, Curtis, of how much of week 2 is on that time calculus, but.
Yeah, so like you said, that this is a week 3, so I would add to what
Sorry.
It is, but it's also in the playbook. So have a look at the playbook about how to actually get your message to your audience. It's towards the end of part 2 of the playbook. But the idea being that, we end up often using general public as our audience because we don't have the time to invest in segmenting our audience or doing multiple communication activities to different people. But we also do general public and we don't necessarily track the results. And so there's no way of saying, did this work or did this not work? We're just there's a term called spray and pray. You just spray your message and pray that it lands somewhere, but there's no way of saying if it did or not. So it's hard to determine that return on time investment if you're not looking at your key performance indicators, which is what we're talking about in week 3 and what's touched on in part of the playbook. So I would say, look at what are the key performance indicators and then start experimenting. Did this work better than this? Okay, we'll do one general public, and next time we have a bit of budget, we'll really get segmented and we'll compare how many people came to the open house or how many people downloaded something from our website. And then you might get a really clear answer and take it from there. So I would say that it is definitely, and it's a question, right? Especially in nonprofits, smaller organizations, municipal governments don't have a ton of budget for these communication campaigns. So it's really determining where do we want to invest that time? And it might be the hard but important conversation to say, let's start here and go from there. Let's start and then reevaluate and see how we can really optimize and get the best results once you know what you're trying to achieve. So I think that we'll end this first part here. We'll give everyone a very quick little break before we dive into the behavioral strategies. This is a bit of a longer session. We're doing a full 2 hours. So so we'll just let you kind of take a little break, grab a cup of coffee, grab a cup of tea or some water, and then let's come back here at 2 o'clock, or just let's give ourselves 5 minutes. So at 2, after 2, And then we will dive into the behavioral strategies that will help us get our communications to now and set ourselves up for the foundations for weeks 2 and 3. I also want to acknowledge that we've seen a few messages in the chat of people who aren't signed up for weeks 2 and 3 and who want to. The sessions are full. They filled up incredibly fast. If you're not signed up and you'd like to come, please email us and let us know. We will try to make clear out spaces for people who don't show up to let folks on the wait list in for weeks 2 and 3. So you can email us. I'll ask Adrienne to pop our email in the chat. There it is. So you can reach out if you're not signed up, and we'll see you back on here in 4 minutes now. So we'll just take a very quick break. All right, that was a quick break. I have a refill of my tea. I hope that was a good little breather for everyone. And we'll get right back into it. We will dive into part 2. So this part is all about exploring the behavioral strategies and examples of how these can be applied into your climate communications. Yeah, so we'll do a high-level overview. I think what I wanted to mention here as we get started is that everything we are covering in this part is included in the playbook. So pages 35 to 45 of the playbook have 13 different behavioral strategies. Each behavioral strategies has several case stories that accompany it that show an example of how that behavioral strategy is applied in a real-world scenario. So we'll just touch on a brief surface, but you can dive into the toolkit to explore more of them later on after the training, and hopefully time and time again as you work on your communications. I will be getting us started here, but Haley will be presenting on these as well. And what we'll talk about is the 13 behavioral strategies here. So it's quite a lot. And we'll really focus in on 7 in particular that are highlighted or that are bolded here. So we won't do a deep dive of all 13. We would need a 3-hour webinar for that or workshop for that. And I don't think anyone feels like doing that quite yet, maybe in person, but not online. And like I said, we have several case stories for each of these real world examples. One thing that I also want to mention as before we get into it is some of them are quite similar or have a lot of similarities. And as you explore it, actually, I'll go to the next slide. We have activity 3 on your activity sheet set up so that you can write notes, so that you can answer questions, reflect on those behavioral strategies as we go through each one of them. And some of them have a lot of similarities, and it's not a all or nothing situation. The behavioral strategies really are meant to work together. I've never seen an example of a communications campaign or effort that only used one behavioral strategy. It's normally a number of strategies together. So I just wanted to mention that little caveat. So to get you all set up to take notes and do activity 3 as we go through the strategies, you can find activity 3 on, I think it's the 2nd and 3rd pages of the activity sheet. And here you'll see the different strategies that we'll go through listed on one hand, and then there's a place for you to answer questions, in particular, how might the strategy work for you for your climate action leaf? What might be challenging? Have you used this before? And could you partner with someone or work with another organization perhaps on that specific behavioral strategy? And the idea of working with, trusted messengers and organizations that can help municipalities in particular break out of the box of open houses, public consultation surveys, and handouts. So we'll just dive right into it. Starting with accessibility. This is actually a good reminder. There's another caveat that I wanted to mention before we dive in here, and it's that a lot of the terms that we use in the Climate Communications Toolkit and in communications language has a different meaning for different contexts. We actually have 3 pages of glossary definitions in the playbook that can be useful, but here accessibility has a lot of different meanings. A lot of the different words might have double meanings as well. But to start, I'll have accessibility, and in this context, we're talking about using the strategy to meet people in your audience where they are, either physically, digitally, and also in terms of their language, cultural references, and making sure that your communications don't create barriers, or rather making sure that your communications overcome barriers so that people can see your message, understand your message, pay attention to your message. And so examples of how you can use accessibility in your climate communications is to really think about your audience. So as you think about your audience beyond general public, think about where do they spend time and what kind of messaging would resonate with them. Is English their first language? And if not, what kind of words should you avoid or use? Maybe you need to have your communications in more than one language even. if the way you're communicating with people involves meeting in person, like an open house or coffee chat, or you're going to set up at an event or something, are the people able to make it? Are they able to have transportation or childcare? Do they work days or nights? So really trying to think, who is your audience and what are some barriers that might make your message or your communication effort inaccessible to them, and how to overcome them. Eva mentioned working with trusted messengers and allies as a way to kind of get over some of the barriers that she was talking about. This one is working with trusted messengers and allies is really great in terms of increasing the accessibility of your communications. Often, if you talk to a certain group, they don't want to talk to people in government or people in a certain organization. It'll put up all sorts of denial, like Eva was mentioning, or different defense mechanisms. So finding people who do have relationships with them, or maybe putting in the time and developing a relationship with the people you're trying to talk to. So an example of accessibility, like I mentioned, we have so many case stories, there's a lot of them, but this one here that we thought we would share is landlords as communicators, as communications partners for extreme heat alerts. And this is an example where the city of Hamilton engages landlords as key partners in delivering messaging around extreme heat to tenants. They actually kind of have two audiences here, landlords and the tenants. But so the city of Hamilton here uses accessibility in that they make information really easy to access for landlords. And then the landlords can then download these editable templates and put them up in the buildings that they manage so that the tenants get the information about extreme heat. So if we focus more on the audience of the tenants here, it's a really great example because you're removing a barrier to access. You're going to see that message every time you come in and out of your building. Landlords also have a position where they are able to talk to everyone at once. So they might not always be trusted. Hopefully they are if they're good landlords. But it's also a way to use trusted messengers to get that information in front of the people that need it most. And so this is an interesting example. I also want to just mention quickly that we have other behavioral strategies. One of them is tipping point and timing. And the example of accessibility here with this particular example also uses tipping point and timing as a complementary strategy, where the landlords actually put up the posters and will engage with their residents or are encouraged to do so during extreme heat events. So at a time where people are more susceptible to say, oh, that's actually happening to me right now. I better pay attention to this message. So that's just an example of how these two strategies can complement each other. Other few things to say about accessibility. Like I said, it works really well with other strategies, tipping point and timing being one of them. Visual storytelling is another great strategy to combine with accessibility. Communicating with visuals removes language barriers and makes information a lot easier to access. It's also very easy to use it on platforms, digital platforms that people visit, like videos, YouTube, social media. And accessibility is a great strategy to overcome barriers, especially climate change as a distant issue, if you put the messaging right where people are. So if you bring it home to them, it also can address other barriers, but that's one we thought we'd highlight here. So we're going to move through all these strategies quite quickly. If you have any questions as we go, put them in the chat and we'll try to kind of come back to them. But I think I'll hand it over to Haley to get into our next strategy.
Thanks, Karna. So I'll be talking about positive framing, which means highlighting the positive outcomes and benefits of taking action. So it's pretty common to see doom and gloom out there, but framing things in a positive way for climate change especially can help bring people into the topic. And so using messaging that focuses on the beneficial outcomes of climate action, like healthy improvements, financial savings, finding what somebody is going to be attracted to what is the positive outcome for them. Using communications to evoke those emotions over facts and information is also really good. I guess everybody can kind of relate to that. You see a message and it's a number. It doesn't mean anything to you intrinsically. Okay, so this much GHG has been removed from the atmosphere. That's great. But what does that actually mean? How do you show that in a positive framing that relates to a person in terms that they can actually conceive of and understand? How does it impact their life? And positive framing is an effective way to inspire concerned but disengaged people, audience members, to take action and address common barriers. It's also a great way to bolster public support and influence social norms. So all of this relates to some of these now pieces of the toolkit, which you can find on page 12 of the playbook. And there's some information about the emotion wheel on there as well. And some of those barriers are listed on page 47 and 50 of the playbook as well. So for example, we have the small acts of conservation, and this is a great case where I guess everybody kind of is looking for a way to take action but doesn't know how to. And this enables people to be able to take that small action and get a positive feeling from it. So being able to take an action like go for a walk, stop mowing your lawn, really simple, small acts that make a real, true impact. And people are always hunting for that little dopamine hit. So I like to think of these actions as a positive way to get a dopamine hit instead of purchasing something or scrolling through your Instagram feed and seeing a cute puppy, which is also fine. So this campaign focuses on ways that people can take those small achievable steps and have that real positive impact. And it makes it accessible, again, for taking part in climate change action and sustainability. And it can be really rewarding. Some other things to note are that it can be combined with behavioral contracts and goal setting. So if somebody is committing to taking this action, you can ask of them to either sign a pledge or respond to a form, post about it on social media. That enables the person to really express that they're committed to taking this action. And they're a little bit more likely to follow through with that because it's a social contract. People are watching. And as well, intrinsic value framing. So not everybody is going to care as much about their lawn. Maybe they value having a nice clean lawn, but they like having bees around. So planting wildflowers is something that they would value more because they care about bees, but keeping a clean lawn is something that they care about too. So how do you find that way to communicate and act, encourage them to act that aligns with their values and doesn't create any kind of cognitive dissonance? And all of this positive framing really helps to combat doom and gloom. We're not talking about what's going to happen if we don't do this. We're talking about what is the great thing that's going to impact you and the world positively by taking action. It can also combat climate misinformation as well by bringing people in to see and feel the experience in a positive way.
All right, so moving along, we've got personalization. So personalization in the sense of a behavioral strategy is when you tailor your communications to reflect the characteristics and past behaviors of your audience. In other words, making your communications very context specific. So you can put them into context in relation to a geographic location, an age group, occupation, or a different step on the journey towards a really big action. Eva mentioned the example of getting someone to renovate their basement to protect from flooding risks. That's a really big, big action. And so having personalized messaging every step of the way to encourage them to take that action is kind of sort of what we're talking about with personalization. I know a lot of people are talking about, subsidy programs in the chat earlier as their action. Having personal messaging, like, okay, you've done step one, now what's next step? What's the next step? Really getting those messages to the people at exactly the right time. So how can you use the strategy in your communications? Again, thinking of your audiences and tailoring the message for those to be relevant, timely, personal, and actionable so that you're moving them along towards that final desired outcome. You can also understand the characteristics and demographics of your audience and build those context-specific communications. So that comes back to combining it with maybe intrinsic value framing so that if you know what they really value, you can combine personalized messaging with their values so that it's more context specific. It will resonate more with your audience. An example of personalization that we've pulled from our case stories here is of the green corporate grounds that the city of Mississauga does with the Credit Valley Conservation Authority. And that's an initiative that helps businesses and institutions reduce stormwater charges and save money, and of course, improve stormwater flow in the city. It's really interesting because in this case, there's a lot of different behavioral strategies. If you click on the link, Adrian just shared in the chat to see the full case story, you'll see that there's actually several behavioral strategies involved in this one. But in terms of personalization, they provide tailored recommendations for people who apply for the program. So they really personalize the action. And then they also do a landscape assessment specific to the property. So again, they're making it really personal. It's very tailored, and people are more likely to actually engage and go through with the stormwater retrofits when that level of personalization is part of the communications. Other things to keep in mind with personalization, you can combine it with a lot of different strategies. Carrots and stick is one that I wanted to touch on, as well as feedback, since we're not going to dive into them today necessarily. But carrots and stick is the idea of, personalizing messaging, again, around subsidy programs, saying, if you apply for this, you will save this much money. And you could say the exact amount of money that's quite personalized, and that might get people to say, oh, you know what? Yes, that is what I need. Or you might be fined this amount of money. That's a stick version. But if you let people know exactly how it will affect them, they're more likely to take action. Feedback is another one where the feedback as a strategy is to provide feedback when someone takes an action, to either normally we'll try to keep it positive, to encourage them to continue taking the action, or to confirm that this was indeed a good action for them to take. And so, for example, you might, in the case of the green corporate grounds, if someone starts putting in their stormwater retrofits, they might get the feedback that says, on this water bill, you've saved this much amount of money. That's a feedback, and the way to make it personal is to say exactly what they're saving, or say exactly what impact they're having. And that, again, will generate that feeling of empowerment and pride, and that sense of, I can do this. So back to Haley now.
So visual storytelling is something that we're all very familiar with. We're living in a very visual time. Everything is online and digital. Everything out in the world is also very visual. So this strategy leverages images, videos, infographics, and other interactive media to convey complex climate information and stories. And it makes it accessible. So not just using words and numbers, providing an alternate way of taking in the information. And as a person that has a background in design, I really like this one. I'm a very visual person, so everything kind of grabs me a little bit more when there's a visual attached to it. Using this strategy, you can make things visible and make things that are intangible more tangible by giving a visual. So that example of greenhouse gas emissions and numbers. Okay, what does that look like? So you can kind of give a weight visually to something like that. It also really helps to evoke emotions again. Um, a lot of this is really tapping into emotions and providing something that can bring people to a place, maybe it's memory or maybe a feeling that they have that is attached to a place and a time. It helps to communicate these messages quickly and brings a bit of stickiness to them. So it helps you remember beyond just having text. I do want to mention that storytelling overall is something that we're going to be covering a little bit more in week 2, and it's covered in pages 26 and 27 in the toolkit as well. So a good example of this is the Saskatoon Home Energy Map. And so the city of Saskatoon introduced a free online tool that allows residents to check their home's digital energy score. So this is another personalization piece as well, but it's visualized in an engaging way, showing color-coded maps, infographics, demonstration videos that present a lot of complex data in a very clear way. And so it also provides that feedback, as I mentioned, and it creates a bit of a social norm and prompts people to engage in this more complex information. It's really just a way to not go through the whole process of getting a heat pump installed, but you're able to go online and see, out of curiosity, what would this do for me? How can it impact my life positively? And so visual storytelling is a great way to combine accessibility, feedback, social norms, and prompts. All of these things are really compatible with each other. So accessibility, again, because visuals are another way to bring people into learning. It's different ways of knowing and seeing and experiencing things. So another way to think about that is if you're taking a look at a video and you see somebody that resembles you or your neighborhood, that kind of social norm of, oh, this person that is like me has taken this action and is involved in a project like this. It also helps you overcome common communications barriers, like moving through disengaged audience and bringing them into it, because there isn't a high barrier of engaging. It's a glance. It's not expecting somebody to read a ton of information. They're able to quickly distill the value out of the piece of information that you're trying to communicate to them, or that feeling. It also brings that visual of this is now, this is here. It's right in front of you. It's not a distant issue.
Yeah, and I'll take it to the next strategy is social norms and prompts. And Haley just mentioned it, and I also just saw something in the chat about communicating, for example, that you can save money and lessen your impact on the environment by eating more plant-based food. Or, looking at the map of the city of Saskatoon's energy map, social prompts playing a really big role in how we communicate those things. In the example of, talking about plant-based diets, if you use social norms and prompts, you can really say, this is something that a lot of people are doing, and it's more likely to then inspire other people to maybe try it out or look into it, or maybe even just, ask more people, is this truly a social norm? Or in the energy map, if you see that your neighbors have a really low carbon emission because they've renovated their basement, and you see that you might be the highest emission house on the block, you're not fitting the social norm anymore, it creates a really strong desire within the human behavior to course correct and go with the norms. I mean, there's pros and cons to all these behavioral strategies, but in the context of climate action, they can be used to really encourage people to take action towards these bigger trunk goals, the bigger strategic goals. So social norms and prompts really refer to social norms or social prompts that encourage people to adjust their actions to align with those of their peers. How you can use this in your climate communications is to think about your audience and find ways to, what are the social circles that they operate within, and how can you use maybe some of the norms within these circles to tailor your messaging so that you're really kind of leaning on existing social norms and prompts. You can highlight behaviors that are common and expected. Testimonials and real world examples are a great way to do this, getting people to talk about their own experiences, getting people to share things on social media. You can also reinforce climate action as a community-wide identity, like the city of Saskatoon does with their map a little bit. And you can also combine social norms with these positive emotions, these emotions of empowerment, the opposite of doom and gloom, getting people to feel like they're part of a movement, they're part of the solution. An example here that we've pulled is how content creators talk about climate change. This is an interesting phenomenon or trend that's increasing, where folks that are in positions of influence, these social influencers now, using cultural moments to insert climate conversations into whatever is happening. In this particular climate or case story, Canadian social media influencers and content creators are leveraging popular cultures to foster climate awareness and inspire action, and we dive into that. And they weave the climate messaging into these bigger elements to really reach different audiences, and then prompt with social cues that this behavior should maybe change. It works really well with cognitive dissonance. That's that denial piece that Eva was talking about earlier. So using social prompts as a way to gently and positively say, this isn't actually the norm, or, we can do something about this. It's a good way to maybe highlight cognitive dissonance and say, here's the action that might work better for you, or that a lot of people are doing. It's also quite connected to social influence, of course, and it can be used to overcome climate change as a distant issue if you're seeing that it's a norm around you to take action. Also, to address climate misinformation, if you find the right social prompts, people who might be misinformed might see that, oh no, actually people in my circle are in fact, doing this, which aligns with a different sort of message. And on to the next one.
All right, so this is going to be a bit of a double. So we're talking about intrinsic value framing, which helps to align climate actions with deeply held values for greater engagement. And this strategy can be used when you're looking to develop communications for specific audiences. So really listening and understanding your audience, honing in on what their values are, will help to communicate better to them. So you can align your climate messaging with deeply held personal values like community well-being, family safety, environmental stewardship. A lot of people, I think there's some stuff going on in the chat, talking about comfort and finding ways to be comfortable with taking these actions. How do we create messaging that aligns with that value of maintaining comfort, but nudging them along a little bit, bringing them towards a change or a different type of action. As well, using communications to evoke these positive emotions. So relating to a value that they hold closely is going to very likely evoke a positive emotion. So the next one, as I said, this is a double, is social influence. And this is very closely related to the strategy that Curtis just talked about, the social norms. So working with respected and admired figures like community leaders, influencers, celebrities, experts that motivate people by example. So when you're working with people in positions of power and influence, these people are those trusted messengers often, and whether they have direct relationship or they're somebody that you have that kind of parasocial relationship. So the people that you see on your TV or your Instagram feed every day. You can work with these trusted messengers and they'll help deliver messages. And sometimes it's a formal partnership that you want to established with them, but other times it's leveraging things that are trending online that an influencer has already been talking about and reposting or something like that. So people will emulate these behaviors because they are influenced by them. Practices of those that they admire or respect, then set those social norms. So a great example that we've discovered is protecting hockey while the climate changes. And so I've learned from my partner, who is a very big hockey person, that Mike Richter is kind of a big deal in hockey. He used to play for the New York Rangers. And in this example, he's somebody that is speaking to the hockey audience about the importance of being concerned and active in taking action against the changes of climate change. So obviously hockey is a sport that requires cold temperatures, and playing outdoors is getting less and less common. So leveraging the broad appeal of hockey, NHL Green, which is their campaign, amplifies climate change awareness, encouraging fans and the broader public to change their behavior. And aligning with Canada's pastime, hockey, it speaks to the personal identity and values of many Canadians who hold this identity of being hockey people near and dear. So it involves high-profile players and that kind of parasocial relationship with celebrity. And so going back to intrinsic value framing, we can combine this with social influence and timing and tipping point. So the right time to hear about that value, maybe you value spending time with your family at certain holidays, and this timing is really important to hear about. Okay, so hockey season is coming, for example. We need to be thinking about climate change and the actions that we can be taking to positively impact and prevent and ensure that we can still do the things that we value and love. And so that social influence really comes into play in that instance because they're delivering that message and you're already listening to them and trusting that message. It can really help to overcome the climate communication barriers of being trying to talk to a disengaged audience. So by engaging them through somebody that they're already listening to. Climate change is a distant issue. This brings it home, brings it to something that is visible, directly related to them, and it can combat climate misinformation. So when you're working with somebody's values, you can reframe it so that it doesn't seem something that is false to them. And so social influence, to go back to that, it helps with accessibility again because it's being delivered by that trusted person that you're already listening to. You follow them on social media, you're watching the hockey night in Canada, and then intrinsic value framing, as we've talked about. So combating all of these different barriers, bringing the message to people, bringing a message that resonates because it's both positive and has value.
All right, so that concludes the big push to talk about, 7 specific behavioral strategies. I saw a question come up in the chat, or a few questions come up in the chat I thought we could address quickly, and I'll invite Haley and Eva to jump in if you have anything you'd want to share, but specifically about how to encourage people to move past comfortable and convenient action and change their action, take the action. I'll just kind of go back to the backflow valve prevention subsidy that we had earlier. It's much easier and more convenient not to tear up your whole basement and install a backflow valve, regardless of the subsidy program. But it's really important if you want to prevent flooding. And so, but that's one example. There's a lot of examples where the actions we might be asking people to take are actually quite uncomfortable, inconvenient, they can be expensive, time consuming. There's all sorts of barriers in there. And I would say there's not one strategy that is the answer. It's really, I would say it's really specific to the audience, to, where you are in your communication activities, what you want to get them to do. Storytelling is always a really, really good one, using trusted messengers. I'm a huge, huge fan of testimonials, saying, this person had the same reservations, the same, worries, and here's how they addressed it, and here's the positive experience they had as a result of going through that discomfort, of addressing that. So I really like to think of what are the reservations, what are the barriers, how can we address them, and how can we use real world examples, trusted messengers, real people to convey that information. So that's just something I wanted to touch on in terms of, yeah, there's no one strategy for everything. It's really dependent on so many factors, and hopefully the different case stories, 30 case stories, can give all sorts of different examples to show how that might be done. I don't know if Eva or Haley, you had anything to add to that.
I put my virtual
Oh,
hand up.
yes, I see your virtual hand.
I wanted to say that I think sometimes we overthink these things. Like, I think it's important to plan these things out, but maybe it's because I currently live with a new teenager that I'm struck by the way children naturally do a lot of these things, right? Like, I think intrinsic value framing is something children are very good at. When my daughter wants something, she has a different way of framing it to ask her dad than she does me. And she knows the levers to use to get me to do something and the levers to use to get him to do something. I see a lot of people smiling and nodding along. Perhaps you too have teenagers at home who are very good at this. And I think we need to just remind ourselves of that. And I think the examples, Curtis, you gave are the professional ways that we would do that. So in my neighborhood, we had a few people regrade their driveways because there was some flooding issues. And I've been talking about this since I was blue in the face, but it becomes, oh, that's Eva and her climate change. But as soon as one of the neighbors did it and told them, yeah, you know what, we finally bit the bullet to do it, we're so glad we did it, blah blah blah, that worked so much more than me harping on the same thing. And so I think it's this combination of all the different levers. And I think that's the one piece I would take away, that I was struck when Haley and Curtis were talking, which was, none of these is the solution. They are all part of a solution. And so, like, some of the case stories seem like really trivial examples, and you're like, oh, no, that's just one thing that they did to push that effort forward. And I think we will have to do many of these many times to take such a wicked problem and take action on it. So I think I'd really encourage people to not look at any one of them as a panacea solution, but as, okay, today I'm going to try this, and tomorrow I'm going to try this, and I'm just going to be trying different levers just to get back to that, like, that children thing. I think we need to be okay with failing and saying, yeah, we thought that would work. It did not work, but it doesn't mean it won't work in a different scenario. So I just would really urge, as we're thinking about these, to say, just because it didn't work doesn't mean it won't, and to be okay with, try again, fall down, get up, try again. Not to be negative about it, but just kind of what's sitting with me, Curtis.
Yeah, definitely. And on the note, I feel that's a perfect segue. On the note of what could work, what might not work, so let's take it back to something very practical that you can walk away from today and go and do in your communication. So back to your climate action leaf. I'd like you to do activity 4, the last activity on our activity sheet on page 4, and that is to summarize your takeaway. So I'd like you to look back to your climate action leaf and just rewrite it on the top of the page there. And then think back to the 7 different behavioral strategies that we talked about, knowing that there isn't one solution and that you might have to come back to this activity sheet a few times, and that's okay. Or maybe you experiment with different actions. Maybe for one action, you do certain behavioral strategies, and for your next climate action leaf, you could try different behavioral strategies, but maybe identify which 1 to 3 behavioral strategies might work well to support your climate action. So you've got the behavioral strategies listed right there on the activity sheet, and they're on screen here too. But which 1 to 3 might work well? And then there's space for what could this look like? What's an idea to put this behavioral strategy into action? And then if you're feeling inspired, you can even write down what would be some next steps. Can you set up a meeting? Can you do a bit of research, read a full case story, talk to someone, to a colleague about this idea? So what are the next steps? And then once we're done doing that, but take your time, we'll end with a final poll where we would love for you to share which of the behavioral strategies you would like to use to support your climate action. So we're already seeing quite a few people excited about visual storytelling and personalization, intrinsic value framing. Okay, so a bit of everything, personalization. Yeah. So a lot of different ways to approach this. And again, I'm going to mention that all of these behavioral strategies are in the playbook as well. So you can revisit any of them. You can get more context about any of them. And in the playbook, each behavioral strategy also includes a few related case stories, so that if you do want to do a bit more research around what personalization or social norms and prompts might look like, you can click through to the case stories in that section of the playbook and then start exploring and discovering other examples and getting inspired to see how that might apply for your situation and your climate action. So yeah, so a little bit of everything, a lot of visual storytelling, a lot of intrinsic value framing. So on this note, I think what I'd like to do is ask folks if anyone would like to share. Does anyone have a behavioral strategy that they're very excited about, that they know exactly how they know exactly what the next steps are to take their behavioral strategies into their communications? I would love to open up the floor. You can share it in the chat if you'd like, or if you want, you can pop yourself on screen and raise your hand. And while we wait, maybe you're still thinking of what to take away from all the behavioral strategies. The next step, really, with all these behavioral strategies that we talked about, would be to then take them and develop messaging as part of our communication activities using these behavioral strategies. And that's actually what we'll do next week in the next session, all about storytelling and messaging. And that session is really about defining your audience. So getting really clear on who your audience is, and then developing messaging that will resonate with your audience. And depending on which behavioral strategies you know you would like to include in your climate communications, you can then use that to say, okay, the messaging will be used in visual storytelling. And then you can kind of shape your messaging around that. Or we're going to develop messaging that is used in conjunction with social norms and prompts. And so maybe your messaging has more to do with sharing personal stories and testimonials. So that would be kind of the next step in terms of how to bring these behavioral strategies into your climate communications. And then in week 3, we'll talk about how to actually put together the plan, the communication journey that we talk about in the playbook, and to really get those messages to your audiences. Again, the behavioral strategies will influence how that is done. anything from the platforms you use, the types of different mediums you use, the partners and individuals you might partner with to deliver the messages. It's all kind of related. And once you know which behavioral strategies you might want to use, it'll influence that, or it can be the other way around too. You don't need to start that. You might go all the way down planning your communications activities and say, how can we include behavioral strategies, and then come back to these ideas and bring them in that way. So I think we're done with this poll, and maybe everyone is just ready to wrap up this webinar at this point. If you do have anything you'd like to share, please pop it in the chat. To finish, I'll just, again, a reminder, we have so many case stories. Please go check them out. The ones bolded here on the slide are the ones that we talked about today. But there's so many points of inspiration that you can go and refer to. And again, we have week 2 and week 3 coming. Again, both week 2 and 3 are full. So if you aren't registered, email us. Adrienne put her email address in the chat earlier. You can email us, and hopefully we can get as many of you in as possible. And again, a reminder that we will be sending the replay to today's session to everyone who's here. So keep an eye on your inbox. And then we'll be sharing the replays for the whole training series once it's done through the ICLEI email list. So just another little plug to join our email list. If you're not on there, you can always unsubscribe after you get the links. And you can also follow us.
Sorry, Chris. I would just say, though, if you are interested in joining the wait list for one of these sessions, maybe put it in your calendar, because we will ping you right before it starts saying, there's room, come on in. So my fear is that if your calendars are like ours, they fill up and then you might not have time to join us. So sorry, just a really practical reminder.
Yeah, practical reminders, always good. And then I was going to say, you can also follow us on LinkedIn. We share a lot of things on there as well. And like I mentioned earlier, we are going to do more of these trainings. We are already planning a webinar around climate communications, and we will host a full immersive session at our upcoming Livable Cities Forum. That's just another little shameless plug here. Please excuse me. But we have the 25 Livable Cities Forum will happen in Halifax, October 6th to 8th. We're really excited. We're going to have a full afternoon dedicated to climate communications in an in-person workshop series. So if you have the ability to travel to Halifax, or maybe you are in Halifax, it'd be great to have you join us. You can save the date for now. We're hoping to open registration soon. And with that, I will say thank you so much to everyone who showed up today. It was great to see so many faces. I think a lot of you went off camera, but it was lovely to know that there's real people on the other side of the screen. It's a nice change from a webinar. And we hope to stay in touch. Hopefully we'll see you next week.